Hello, everyone, and welcome to the International Sustainable Resilience Center webinar, Public-Private Partnerships, a Plan for Sustainable National Recovery in the USA. I'm David Dodd, CEO of the Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you. The International Sustainable Resilience Center is an independent nonprofit that is affiliated with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, Public-Private Partnership Center of Excellence. We have a dual mission to promote and to facilitate the development of public-private partnerships to enhance disaster resilience and sustainability, and also to integrate resilience and sustainability into all types of public-private partnerships worldwide. I'm honored to welcome three global experts in the PPP arena to discuss how sustainable public-private partnerships can lead economic recovery from the COVID-19 crisis and the accompanying economic crisis. Your moderator is Special Projects Director Kim Smith, and I will be more than happy to allow each of you panelists to introduce yourself briefly. And participants, please feel free to enter questions in the chat room. We will have a significant amount of time to review questions. So we hope you enjoy this. And with that, I'll hand it to you, David Baxter.
Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, whatever time zone you're in. And it's a pleasure for us to be here to talk a bit about the public-private sector, or the PPPs, and what's happening with the public sector in the United States over the next hour. Each of the panelists was carefully chosen for their knowledge of what's happening in the region. And we are going to be exploring whether PPPs can be used as a strategy to help the country recover from the economic impacts of the pandemic. I'm a senior advisor to the ISRC, and I'm working with the team, and I have been deeply involved with public-private partnerships all over the world. You can do the next slide, Kim. So it's been a few weeks ago, I wrote a blog, which I called 10-Point Public-Private Partnership Plan for the National Economic Recovery in the USA. Especially after the inauguration of President Biden, this gained traction, and it's had about nearly 5,000 reads over the last week. And really what I was talking about is that public-private partnerships have the tremendous potential to help the United States recover from the negative impacts of the COVID pandemic. I firmly believe that if we could find ways to encourage partnerships between the public and private sector, where they could leverage between them innovative long-term ways of implementing infrastructure, where they could also find collaborative ways where we could share resources, we have the great opportunity to introduce resilient projects and sustainable projects. And this would only be achievable if there was great collaboration. I think there's also bipartisan support in the United States at the moment. We've heard this and seen this in the press for the need for the United States to improve its infrastructure. And these infrastructure improvements could add as a catalyst or stimulus to economic recovery. The partnerships between the public and private sector would find a way to mobilize alternative financing for the cash-strapped public sector, especially those who have faced considerable challenges recently due to declining revenues through tax revenues, for example. Next slide. In the 10-point plan that I talked about in the blog, and you can read it on your own time if you wish, is that there is a need to strengthen a national PPP advisory unit or units. The United States is unique in the sense that it doesn't have a true national PPP unit like other countries do due to the devolution of powers and authority to the different states. Because of this, I also believe that it would be critically important to create a national PPP advisory steering committee which has politicians, stakeholders, practitioners, companies involved together. This would help strengthen the state and also national PPP enabling environment, because the laws in many states don't exist or are sort of vague, and they need to be tightened up if you want to create an enabling environment for PPPs. There also is a need for coordination between long-term, medium-term, and short-term strategies for economic recovery, and PPPs can play a role here. I also believe that not all projects are good for PPPs, so it would be critically important that we perform a triage in some other way to look at projects and decide which ones are going to offer the most benefit and focus on those. It's also important that both the states and interstate projects also are supporting this national recovery process. We will need some standardization of PPP procurements as well, because it's confusing if you have 50 different standards in the United States to implement these projects, and would make it very difficult for a coordinated and enthusiastic approach to PPPs. Obviously, it's also critically important that we have competitive and transparent procurement of PPP projects, and this is especially important if the government decides to launch emergency PPP projects. At the center, we are very focused on people first PPP projects as well. And this is a new approach or a new look where we focus on people, not just value for money, but value for people and also value for the future, to create projects which are, let's say, future-proofed and can be more sustainable and resilient. And this is why it is critically important that if we want to have a sustainable national economy, we need to be looking at future-proofing of PPP projects. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Seth Miller-Gabriel. I'm director and co-lead of BDO USA LLP's infrastructure team here in the US. BDO's done PPPs in the US for several decades, but we just kind of stood up very recently a PPP focused unit here in the US, working with our partners in Canada, the UK, and around the world. Talk a little bit today about opportunities for the private sector in the US when it comes to public-private partnerships. And if we can move on to the next slide, we'll dive right in. All right, so first the question is, like, why would the private sector want to get involved in infrastructure? Why go through all the headache of going through procurements and developing a working public-private partnership? So as many of you, or maybe all of you know, infrastructure in the US does continue to age. Our infrastructures in total are all right. Definitely a large maintenance backlog, especially in the buildings area for public buildings. Roadways in many areas are not what they should be. Mass transit systems are woefully inadequate in most urban areas. And other newer infrastructures like broadband connectivity, the failings of developing those has really come forward here in the pandemic, where we see areas both urban and rural that lack the kind of internet connectivity needed for things like at-home schooling and working from home and other necessities that have come together in this modern economy of ours. So it's kind of the state of play in infrastructure in the US. On the other hand as well, still on the slide, you have an increasing difficulty and complexity when trying to develop infrastructure projects. You have more stakeholders than ever, more stakeholders have agency than ever before, who want to influence how those projects are done, increasing the complexity, cost, and time needed. So the private sector is looking at this opportunity and saying, why do we want to get involved? Well, the real answer is that the private sector has always been involved in infrastructure in the United States. Here in the US, even though state, local, federal government agencies procure different infrastructures, they're not the ones who design that infrastructure or build it. They might finance it, and sometimes they don't even operate it. So this is just really a natural progression to the P3 of where you have the private sector taking on more responsibility, but having even more accountability. And with that comes a lot more opportunities. So we'll go to the next slide now. Looking at the next slide. So, there we go, thank you. So you have the private sector bringing innovation to infrastructure in these projects. This is why the public is interested in having them. You have that innovation that drives efficiency. So if you look at the efficiency, a lot of the efficiency coming from better mitigation of risk and aligning all those risks, it's in that risk mitigation and that efficiency where you find the real cost savings and the real place where the private sector, let's be honest, can make profit on these infrastructure projects. That's where their bread and butter is. That's what they're very good at. What the public needs to do, and we'll talk about as we go forward, is tap into that innovation, tap into that efficiency, and make sure that all of us together, while we build back better, as President Biden talks about, we're doing so in a way that we're all doing well financially, but while doing good for everyone from the infrastructures. So with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague Oscar, who will continue on with our presentation.
Hello, everybody. My name is Oscar Cortez. I'm a binational engineer, civil engineer. I am the VP for International Relations for the Mexican Federation of Civil Engineers, and also president of the local chapter of the Professional Engineers in California government, and a member of the American Society of Civil Engineers. So my topic today will be the value and need for U.S. participation in transnational PPPs, with an emphasis on the border area. So if you go to the next slide, please. In order to understand a little bit the ambitious plan that the new administration has to build a modern, sustainable infrastructure and equitable clean energy, we gotta get a good handle of what the situation is currently. The American Society of Civil Engineers every 4 years has a performance card to grade the infrastructure in the United States. The last one was in 2017. We are currently working on the 2021, should be out hopefully by mid-year. But I'm going to use data from the 2017. It shouldn't be that different. But the magnitude is important to understand so we can see where the opportunities and where are the needs for infrastructure. So the United States has an annual 160 billion annual cost of traffic delays and congestion. So that means our infrastructure related to freeways and highways needs to be upgraded, increase capacity. Although the situation with COVID has changed a little bit the conditions and less people are driving, obviously, and also the revenues from the gas taxes are going down. So there can be an opportunity to maybe create a different vehicle with a triple P. Also, 49% of all the vessels involved in inland waterway and also ports experience delay every day. So that in itself creates an opportunity for port development. Over the next 2 decades, we will have 56 million new users of water resources and the wastewater treatment plants. So we had to upgrade that situation. Obviously, sanitation, that's another opportunity. The Biden administration is really emphasizing rail, according to the last comments they've been making. Amtrak, I'm sure, will get a boost. But also public transit within the local municipalities, we have a 51% of all Americans are not near the access to get to public transit. So that also presents an opportunity. We have a 43-year age of all structures for bridges, which means they're obsolete. They need to be upgraded, and 9.1% are considered to be structurally deficient. So that means that are in danger of collapsing. So if you go to the next slide, please. The United States currently is ranked 16th in the world in infrastructure development and also accessibility. And that's a very important number to consider. We've been kind of lagging over the last 2 decades, especially in investment in infrastructure. And we have an aging infrastructure in many respects. So the American Society of Civil Engineers rate us with a D+, in the year 2017. So that's barely passing grade. So it is estimated that the investment backlog for exceeds $4.5 trillion. And actually, this has grown over 25% since 4 years ago per this current year. And the available funding resources will have a $2 trillion deficit in current needs. So if you can see the magnitude of what is required and what the funding deficits are, it's the challenge that the infrastructure has in the United States. Now, what additional challenges do we have? So the problem is not to source and how to allocate. Source is a funding issue. Allocate is where do you put the money? So it was mentioned before that we need to find projects that can be suitable for Triple P. That will be part of the allocation strategy. Not all projects are Triple P bond, so we need to have a screening process and create a pipeline to have distinct listings of projects that can qualify for Triple P. And I think, like David Baxter mentioned before, having a PPP unit, not only in the States, but a centralized can help us with that task. It has a lot of political risk, even though right now we have some bipartisan support. In the past, there's been some going back and forth between what's needed for the development with the traditional methods of build and operate versus the new ones that with the alternative delivery structures that we have, such as it could be design built all the way to Triple Ps and even private ownership. It was mentioned before, we have a very strong local, state, and federal authority. So that's a lot. That in itself creates a lot of reviews and also constraints that hinders the development of Triple Ps. We have had experience of projects that have failed. And one of the things is they're too big to fail. You know, that's one of the critics making that point. Some of them don't reach even financial closing. But there's also an opportunity because in the United States, we can innovate. And right now in the transportation sector, there's actually a couple of interesting innovation projects. You know, we have not only the high-speed rails, there's particular projects that can be done through the non-solicited proposal approach. There's one, for example, in Los Angeles to Las Vegas. There's a high-speed rail proposal by a company. It's a non-solicited proposal. That's a perfect example of using innovation and using the private sector to find a need for a particular project. The United States also has an interesting background. A lot of the infrastructure is already privatized. So it's been built, particularly the broadband is mostly private. The telecommunication is mostly private. The healthcare sector is mostly private. However, the surface transportation is mostly public. Ports some of them are public-private ships, some are private. The aviation sector, the airports are mostly public-private partnerships. Freight, most of it is private already. Power is, some of them is public and some of them, most of it is private. So you can see that already a lot of the infrastructure, it's in private hands, but it doesn't mean that the rest of the infrastructure, we can find additional methods of delivery such as Triple Ps that can alleviate that funding gap. And one of the constraints is, it is not necessarily a constraint, it is also something that's important, that the United States has a very robust municipal bond market. However, that only means that you have a certain capacity to bond the municipalities or the agencies, and that capacity is getting to critical levels. So that in itself can create an opportunity to have a PP approach to reduce that dependency only on municipal bonds. And if you go to the next slide, please. As you can see here, United States, as renegotiated the NAFTA deal between Canada, United States, and Mexico. It is now called the U.S. Mexican-Canada Court. It was ratified in the year 2020. It replaced NAFTA from 1994. And it has been a success story. And I'm going to talk about a little bit more emphasis with the U.S.-Mexican border. Obviously, there's a lot of opportunity on the Canada-U.S. border, but I don't have enough time to talk about that, but I'll concentrate on the Mexican border. We share with Mexico approximately 2,000 miles of common border. It is the most frequently crossed international border. We have 38 border crossings, POEs are called. The investment has grown from $166 billion to $556 billion per year. The investment between the United States and Mexico. We're behind Canada, we're the third largest partners with the United States. And the relationship with Mexico and the United States goes beyond trade. There's a lot of cultural ties, a lot of opportunities. So we are promoting that the border area between Mexico and the States create a energy sustainable corridor that will create a pipeline of projects that can be addressed through a sustainable process, obviously in triple Ps, for renewable energy projects, improve the ports of entries, which are obsolete. Some of them need upgraded on both sides of the country. Create desalination projects that can feed the arid parts of the northern part of southern part of the United States and northern parts of Mexico. Create a binational commitment. And that in itself, I think, is an opportunity to even create a P3 unit especially for binational projects around this area. I think that would be something that the organization that we're working with, the American Society of Civil Engineers, FEMSIC, and the WAP, World Association of Public-Private Partnerships, as well as ISRC can spearhead to create a P3 unit that will concentrate and emphasize the opportunities that are needed for this binational area. So with that, I'll let everybody make some questions. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Oscar. And on behalf of ISRC, I just want to again thank all three of our panelists, Oscar, Seth, and David Baxter, for sharing these opening comments. So, as you know, we're living in the world of Zoom instead of live conferences, but we don't want to lose that opportunity to have conversation amongst each other and our peers on these topics. So I'm going to get us started with some questions that we've already developed, but if anyone has anything you'd love to ask the team, feel free to submit it through the chat panel or through the Q&A. And the point of the rest of this meeting is just to facilitate some conversation on these topics. So we are open to anything you guys want to discuss as well. But to get us started, so we've heard three people talk from the public sector, from the private sector, and kind of combining them both from a transnational perspective. But I want to start the conversation today with combining those topics to where we are in the U.S. right now. We're recovering from the impacts of COVID-19 and the pandemic, and we're in the state of this economic crisis, you might say. So my opening question, and I'm gonna, David Baxter, put you on the spot to maybe get us started, is why do you think PPPs are the answer for, or a answer, shall we say, for economic recovery?
Well, thank you for the question. The main reason, I think, is that the resources of the public sector have become even more limited in the pandemic period. And we find that the funding gap that previous speakers have referred to has grown bigger because of loss of tax revenues. And so there is a need from the public sector for greater participation in the private sector. And it makes sense The private sector has innovative approaches. It's able to deliver projects efficiently and on time. And I've always just felt that why not bring the public and the private sector together to leverage their common resources, whether it's knowledge, regional knowledge, specific policies, specific development objectives, whether it's innovation, whether it's alternative financing, and then help build projects that otherwise would not get built. And I think the critical importance is public sector needs the financing from the private sector, but the private sector needs projects from the public sector so that it can build and create jobs and create opportunities for businesses. And I think that's far better than bailing out companies. It's a good way to get them involved and give them an opportunity to be part of a recovery strategy where they get paid for and incentivized to deliver good projects and create jobs.
Great. Seth, Oscar, anything to chime in from your perspectives?
I think the importance here is the funding gap. There is an opportunity here for the private sector to get more involved. Also, you got to remember one thing about innovation. It's not only innovating in new technologies, it is also a way to innovate new materials, in a way to have less maintenance using a more life cycle analysis that will reduce the operation and maintenance part of it. And I think the private sector has that opportunity, especially when you compare that the municipal bond market is a very important in the United States, and the bonding, the funding sources, usually the public sector has a better interest rate than the private here. And I'm talking about the United States. In other countries such as Mexico, it's the opposite. The private sector has a better opportunity to get cheaper resources. But here the private sector can involve in technology and also innovation and in creating that sustainable life cycle analysis that will bring a very competitive project.
And I will add one thing that there is, we always want to, I probably should have begun and ended all P3 conversations with understanding the difference between funding and financing. I mean, the private sector is going to bring some innovative financing tools, but that's still debt and equity at the end of the day. So the public sector is going to have to find those funding streams, those revenue streams to pay for these new infrastructures or upgrades, which even though the economy is not great right now, we have high hopes. And Kim, I share your optimism that we are recovering. I think there's still a few things, the economy maybe not quite yet, but we'll get there. And there's definitely pent-up demand in the economy for things. I mean, people have not gone out to see movies or eaten out or traveled. So I think we might see a boost once people can start to do those things again. But I think one of the things that's coming out of the pandemic is this realization that many of us in the infrastructure space have been saying for all too many years, that the public sectors and our elected officials and governments at all levels really need to pay attention to infrastructure. It was always kind of this idea of, well, we'll kick the can down the road, we'll make the repairs we need to now, but we'll do the big fixes next year. So it's next year's capital budget. Well, next year's capital budget ran right into COVID. The budget went away, and we realized that we had a building stock, an infrastructure stock that was not modernized, couldn't handle this pandemic or the ensuing economic problems. We had a telecommunications system that didn't meet the need. And now we, as in kind of the public, are going to have to pay for that. We're going to have to figure out the telecommunication. We're going to have to figure out how we get better HVAC systems into all public buildings. I sure as heck don't want to go into a public building unless I know the filters are much better than they were before COVID. All that's going to cost money. And I think this is really an opportunity for P3s where we have the private sector come in and say, all right, public sector, you can do it the way you used to and just kind of fix what you see now. Or why don't we work together through a P3 and fix this better and fix it for the long term in such a way that cost of ownership will be less.
Thank you, Seth. Okay, so we've got some good questions coming in, and I will get to everyone, but there's certainly some questions on the financing and topic here. So So from Michael Olivier, thank you. He says a nationwide PPP program has to be accompanied with an incentive for private sector investment that could be tax-based and grant-based. So I will read his question, and then from Martin, sort of from the opposite side, his question is, with COVID already consuming over $4 trillion in budgets, what kind of success are you expecting the administration to have in gaining this support for a massive infrastructure investment? So, you know, two big comment and question on that. Seth, can I just go back to you really quick for, you know, what your thoughts on incentive for private sector investments that Michael references?
Yeah, sure thing. I'll try to cover. So I think I'm going to go on a limb here and make an assumption that money will be spent. There will be another recovery or stimulus or whatever you want to call it that will come out of the new administration. And so I would advocate, and I think many of us would advocate, that that money be directed, one, towards infrastructure, because it is a historically proven generator of jobs and growth, and that's kind of proven throughout history. When governments want to boost the economy, infrastructure is the way to go. We're just saying, hey, invest that money, please, by all means, invest that money in infrastructure, all infrastructures, plural. But let's do it in a smarter way that fixes not just today's problem and today's economy, but puts the U.S. in a position where it has the economy of tomorrow with the infrastructures tomorrow, and we're going to do that through P3s. To the first question about a national program, it'd be great to have a national program, but that will require a lot of rethinking and retooling. Because here in the U.S., infrastructure procurement or support from the government, quote unquote, it's really governments. The federal government has a lot of programs for financial funding or financing support. USDOT is the Build America Bureau, HUD has different agencies, but by and large, infrastructures, the buildings and roadways, are owned by the states and localities, all the way down to towns, more so than the federal government. And so to have a national program would really be one of the federal government declaring, all right, we want to have public-private partnerships or innovative project delivery in that format. We, the federal government, will provide some sort of incentive first to the states and localities to explore these innovative options. That's step one. And then two, once those options are identified and utilized, to really provide support as far as the public support into these projects, so that funding or financing long-term. And then maybe some changes, possibly maybe into tax code or how things are recognized for the private sector when they're making investment into public infrastructure. There's been a lot of debate about that, of how should these things be viewed when you're looking at federal and state taxes, when say an equity fund, a pension fund really is making an investment into a public infrastructure, or a toll road or a school system. Is there a way we could view that that's more favorable to that kind of investment to the benefit of everyone? But I'm just saying, first, it's kind of the wonky policy thing first, more so like we're going to have a national infrastructure group and that's it. It doesn't work that way in the U.S. due to the federal system.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Seth. David Baxter, before moving on, any comments from you? I know you wrote and spoken a lot about this, but what kind of support are you expecting this new administration to get in terms of investing in significant infrastructure projects?
Well, I think in some way, as Seth touched on it, they've got to find a way to, make investments more favorable, if you want to call it that, because there's been a very heavy reliance on municipal bonds, and that has kind of inhibited the growth. I think also what is important is to educate investors as well as the banks, for example, more about what PPPs are really about and what the expectations are. There's also a great need to invest or to educate politicians, because there are many politicians globally, and I'm sure in the United States, who believe that PPPs are nothing more than just a vampire blood-sucking sort of activity that sucks out, the money and leaves everyone poorer. I've heard terms that it definitely mustn't be something that resembles, what do they call it, the nationalization of debt and privatization of profit, so that, the private sector gains and the public sector gets nothing out of it. And then I think also, a gentle discussion that, profit does incentivize the the operators of PPP projects to perform well. That obviously also, makes investors happy because they know they'll get a return on the investment. But just an understanding that reasonable profits that are controlled in some other way, that they don't go rampant and yet don't de-incentivize people by taking them away, need to be discussed, and the understanding of profit, because profit is what's going to drive it. And the concern is that, well, if the private sector performs well and it makes excessive profit, this is terrible. And my comment is, if the private sector performs well and makes profit, isn't this the incentive for what you want? So we need to have those discussions behind those sort of concerns that exist. But I think that would also be very helpful is maybe to have a national infrastructure bank, or as they said, if this doesn't work, to consider this at state level infrastructure banks on the arts, banks of that ilk around, so that this financing or cross-financing or hybrid financing, there's many different ways, and you could go crazy trying to describe all the different types of financing opportunities. But if those could be there to encourage financing and bridge the funding gap, I think we have a good start.
Thank you. Okay. Oscar, in your comments, you mentioned some of the unsolicited proposals, and we did have a question come in, so I want to start with you. If you can speak a little bit, just backing up, what are the regulations for unsolicited PPPs in the United States? And then related, what do you see as the main barriers, as well as how can they play a role in the U.S. recovery? And this is a question from Ann Laura through the Q&A panel. Could you start us off on this topic on unsolicited proposals?
Sure, Kim. Unsolicited proposals is a mechanism to develop private-private partnership or for projects that were not identified as a need in either the planning documents or the pipeline of projects that both the local governments, municipals, obviously state and federal have in the radar. So it has opportunity for the private sector to, like I mentioned before, innovate, find out where the certain situation where you can create a solution to a problem, and use that platform of the unsolicited proposal. Now, I think we should need to kind of tweak around the laws. Each state has its own particular laws related to triple Ps. It's not uniform, so that in itself creates a situation, especially where projects involve transportation that cross interstate lines. So maybe create a, as we said before, a more uniform approach to the laws involved for the unsolicited proposal. And also incentivizing, have an opportunity for the private sector to get some leverage by having points before in the tender process that guarantees that if you do that investment at risk, like everything in the feasibility analysis, the engineering part, and the project goes to the procurement process and it's granted to you, you get some opportunity to have a bit of what's the word, a plus if you develop it. Since all projects need to be tendered and they're open to all public infrastructure companies, okay, if you give you that plus, that will give you an incentivize to develop that. So what was the other question that you said? The examples of triple P, unsolicited proposals? So we have, like I mentioned before, the one that's right now, that's a good project going from LA to Las Vegas. But I think one of the opportunities is with the communities, the small communities, have a community involvement. So there are projects that can be smaller in scale. They can be non-solicited proposal. It can be done at the community level, or they're called community-based triple Ps, which involves resolving situations, especially with wastewater projects, water projects, stormwater, and energy projects that can have that. It's called community choice, where you can have your own renewable energy and just have a power purchasing agreement with the local utility companies and generate the energy for the community. And it's a way to actually socialize the projects that incorporates people first, which is something that's very important. We need to make them more socially acceptable and more geared to the needs of the people without compromising, obviously, the financial part.
Great. Building on that, David Baxter, can I come to you? Can you talk a little bit about like the regulations or even the process if a group came together to develop an idea of how they would get their project in front of the right folks? What does that look like? Because I think that's some of the mystique of like, how do you take it from an idea to getting it moving?
Thank you. So one of the critically important things about unsolicited proposals is that you've got to have a very well articulated argument that you are going to present to a public agency. As Oscar said, it's critically important that this shouldn't be a project that's already being considered by the public sector or in their pipeline, because that will cause controversy. Many people will feel that, then you're trying to bypass the procurement process and, jump ahead of the line and get your own project out there. What is important, it needs to be innovative, a new idea. It also needs to fulfill the purpose of the government or the agency that you are approaching. And what is needed is a very clear and careful understanding of the project, and then and sort of an analysis by the public sector that this is really a project that is worthwhile or bears merit as a PPP. And then you want to protect the private sector's knowledge or ideas as well. So there's got to be some protection for intellectual property, because it's no good that if the project is proposed and then it just gets put out on the street and everyone then jumps on it and the originator of the idea loses, sort of control, and the project's given to somebody else. And the big question that is centered around unsolicited proposals is, how do you address competition and how do you address transparency? Typically, most countries will consider a PPP project, and if an unsolicited project, and if it's a good one, they will then open it up to competitive and transparent bidding. But they will do it by giving certain protections to the private sector, protecting intellectual property, for example, or they would give them a bonus if they didn't win the project, but it went to somebody else. They would be paid compensation. They'd be given also a first chance to make an alternative bid on price if they were not selected based on price. There's a number of ways of doing it, but it's critically important in some ways to open up to this. What's very interesting, a lot of people don't realize, is that the state of Pennsylvania, or the Commonwealth, I'm not sure if it's a Commonwealth or a state, they have 2 times a year where they allow unsolicited proposals to be submitted through a special electronic portal that they've created, but they do control the type of projects. So for the last few years, they've done it for small bridges. And so you can go in, and if you've got a good idea of how to build alternative bridge or whatever, you can submit an unsolicited proposal and it's considered in that way. And in that way, the states also, or the public sector entity, can make sure that it's not inundated with frivolous unsolicited proposals, because that also happens. But it's a great opportunity as long as there's some enabling environment, legal framework or something behind it to ensure that the system isn't exploited.
Great. Thank you, David. Okay, let's go to another question from our audience. This one is from John Sellers. He asks the group, is there any one thing which is going to push state and local officials to take a risk, to get out of their comfort zone with traditional finance and go about things in a different way? So pushing state and local officials to take a risk. Anyone want to respond to that? Seth?
Sure, and then David ends up too. I think we're here. I mean, in many states and localities, the credit card is maxed out. There is certainly a risk in some places, and I'm not saying that I know anywhere in particular. There's certainly a risk of a possible downgrade of credit rating. I don't think we'll see that. I think we'll see a lot maybe put on watch list just because of the current economic situation when the rating agencies start to take into account what's going on. And that can be devastating when it comes to those municipal bonds. I mean, a change of credit rating is a very significant event. And so because of that, you might begin, I think we will begin to see state and localities start to get out of their comfort zone and look at things differently. Now, a caveat on that, before I let David say anything, and he corrects me, is that a P3, we don't want to say that all states and localities, when they go through a public-private partnership, especially if it's something under an availability payment, the current model here in the US is that is still debt. That's still an obligation. So it's not off balance sheet. So we're not doing anything off balance sheet. So that doesn't help there. What we're talking about is entering into agreement with the private sector in a way to use an asset maybe a little bit differently that maybe generates more economic activity or new revenue that wasn't there, or activates some public real estate in particular that may not be used at the moment, using it for private activities that may generate some new revenue. So I think we're at that point right now.
Thanks, Seth. On spot, I was about to say, I don't think we have a choice. Just how you started, we're at that situation where new financing, new resources, new innovation, everything is needed because we are in a we're stuck in the mud, or we're in a pickle, whatever the expression is at the moment. And we've got to do something if we're going to kickstart the economy. And it's just beyond me why the public sector wouldn't reach out to the private sector and why the private sector wouldn't do that as well, back to the public sector. Because there's organizations sitting on piles of money waiting to put it somewhere, but they need somewhere to, some sort of incentive. And I think one thing that is critically important is trying to help the public sector officials and, the electorate or the constituents, politicians' constituents understand that PPPs are not privatization. This is one thing that drives me absolutely insane when I hear people say, well, we can't do that because we're giving away, county or city or state assets. The term public-private partnership refers that it's a partnership between the public and the private sector. And when you privatize it, it's not a PPP anymore. So, people need to really sit down and understand that, what is happening with the PPP, which is great, is in this time of stress and risk and challenge, if you hand it over to the private sector and you've set clear outcomes and goals and you incentivize them, they can manage a lot of the projects and challenges and risks that you don't have the time to do it. And by that, I mean the public sector. So it's a win-win situation, but it is critically important to understand that not all projects work as PPPs, and that the naivety needs to go away, and there needs to be a clear education of both parties of what's happening when you move that way. So, we have a choice. Do we just not build bridges because they collapse? And then you're going 100-mile round because there's no money for it? Or do you do all sorts of, or do you not build hospitals? You can go down the list. Do you not build schools, etc. And that is, some of the things that we have to consider. Seth, I'm glad your daughter joined you. And
yes, she likes to be on webinars. So.
That's good.
I normally have my cats prancing behind me. So
may I make an additional comment on that respect? We did mention that a lot of the infrastructure in the United States, it's already privatized. So that argument that we're privatizing, a lot of it is already in private hands, especially healthcare, broadband. So you can use that as an argument. A lot of it is already in private hands. And the other thing is we got to look at triple Ps from a more regional approach. We got to leverage our geographical locations and our trade partners. I did mention that we just reaffirmed the U.S.-Mexican-Canada Accord. I think that's an opportunity, especially for border projects on both the Canada and the Mexican border, to create economic development zones. they will, through Triple Peace, we have a need for renewable energy projects. We have a need for water supply. We have a need for creating intermodal platforms to promote trade coming across the border on both countries. So there's an opportunity if the states, at least the border states, get together and create a zone, and the politicians are lobby to have this economic development zone. I think that'll be a good opportunity, and the same will be with the U.S. Canada. So look at it from that angle. We need to have each region has its own vocation and particularities. And the inter part of the United States, I think, is going to get a lot of boosts, especially with rail. The Biden administration has heavily mentioned that he wants to promote rail. So rail is part of the logistic platform for a good trade. So, and link that rail to the border area so we can get goods and movements of services faster and more productive.
Right. We have one more question from the audience, from David Soldner, and I actually think it is a perfectly timed question with what we are seeing in the United States now, with a new administration that is coming in, and basically the first order of work is to undo a lot of the activities of the prior administration. So we're seeing that happen in real time right now. And David's question to the group is the following. So the involvement of the private sector encourages continuity and the responsibility from the public sector in regards to developing a PPP program and project pipeline. How can we reinforce continuity for PPP programs in the face of political transition? So I think there's a real important question about future-proofing projects so the next administration that comes in doesn't undo all of the hard work. And David Baxter, I saw your hand go up, so would you like to respond to this one?
Yeah, I think, what we need to realize is that public-private partnership projects have a long timeline. So we're looking at 20, 30, 40 years. Here in Virginia, they even did one that was 99 years, which is still mind-boggling for that. But that does introduce a certain amount of continuity instead of being, tied down to political leadership that every 4 years in the country or every, I don't know when municipal elections take place every few years, that a new politician can come in and introduce a new, how would you call it, new policy, and then all the projects get canceled and they start rebuilding constantly. And I've worked with a number of federal agencies where they've built up to getting something done, and then there's a new administration and the book gets thrown out the door and everyone starts reorganizing, recalibrating and everything. And that's not going to happen with PPPs, because once you've committed to it, you committed to the period of 20, 30 years. And that would introduce continuity. And that, I think, kind of mitigates a little bit against the constantly changing political environment. One thing I would say that is critically important for politicians to realize, that if they are sponsors of a project that is successful, it will make them look good. So they shouldn't oppose it. And also, once you have committed to a project, when there's a new administration, you shouldn't be able to be in this situation just say, I don't support that project anymore. Because under a PPP, there's a contractual obligation for the term of the contract. So, I think that's one of the ways of, ensuring that projects, if they have full political support, that they can continue without outside interference, unless the provider or the concessionaire is failing in what they're supposed to be doing.
Great. Okay, we have a few minutes left, and so a couple of things with that. I want to, on behalf of our ISRC, just thank all of our panelists today, and also let everyone listening here know everyone is available on LinkedIn. So if you have follow-up questions, feel free to connect with anyone here, or you can reach out to ISRC directly for more information. We will also make a copy of the presentation available. We had some requests, so if anyone is looking for that, happy to do that. But I just want to, thank everyone for helping us just open our minds to this conversation and the opportunities that we have before us. And to close us out for the day, I'm going to hand the mic back to Mr. David Dodd, the CEO of ISRC, who opened us up and is going to close out our session today with a few final comments. But thank you again, everyone, and thank you especially to all of our panelists.
Thank you so much, Kim, and my thanks as well to our wonderful panelists. And thanks to all of you for participating with us in this discussion. Just a couple of closing observations. There's a reason we chose sustainability and resilience as the focus of this organization. Those are both risk reduction, inherently reduce risk. And if public-private partnerships can be, as David Baxter has said, future-proofed through building in resilience and sustainability. And that goes back to Michael Olivier's question about what government can do. And if government can help subsidize resilience and sustainability being built into these projects, then that's necessarily going to reduce risk to the private sector who may operate those facilities and have to be responsible for their maintenance. But wonderful questions from everyone of the participants. Thank you so much. Oscar had mentioned People First, public-private partnerships. Please go to our website to learn more about that. It's a really important movement that's underway to put people first and to ensure that the values of transparency and equity and sustainability and resilience are all embedded into public-private partnerships around the world. Again, thank you so much. We're here if you want to ask any questions later on. As Kim said, just contact us. Thanks so much for participating.